We are stepping right back into the Tolu Islam digital archive today. And specifically, we are focusing on Lecture 12 out of 15.
Right, the lecture series covering the Quranic philosophy of Allama Parwez.
Exactly. And the overarching mission for this deep dive is to explore his really, deeply analytical reading of Surah An-Nahl, Ayat 101.
Yeah, it's a massive, massive historical and theological collision.
It really is. We're trying to understand why traditionalists, throughout history so often mistake what is essentially a divine system upgrade for human meddling.
Which is such a fascinating way to frame it. And just to set the stage for you listening, we are going to unpack these arguments exactly as they are presented in this archival material.
Right, totally impartially.
Yeah, impartially. We're looking at the evolution of law, the historical charge of forgery against messengers, and, well, the sociological mechanisms that keep societies frozen in time.
It's a lot, right?
It is a lot. But our goal is to show the architecture of how Parwez views the text. Not as some static historical artifact, but as a dynamic engine for human progress.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to really wrap our heads around what Parwez is arguing here, I want you to imagine, just for a second, that you are sitting down to play a really complex board game.
Okay, I'm with you.
So you've been playing this specific game for years with your group. You know all the strategies, you've memorized the rule book cover to cover, and you're comfortable. The mechanics are just second nature.
Right, you've mastered the system.
Exactly. But right in the middle of a session, the game master walks into the room, takes your battered old rule book off the table, sets it aside, and hands you a brand new one with updated mechanics. What is the immediate reaction?
Oh, total resistance. I mean, people get confused, they get defensive, and inevitably they get angry.
Yeah. They're like, what are you doing?
Exactly. The immediate assumption is always that the game is being ruined or, that the game master is just arbitrarily changing things on a whim to mess with you.
Right. But then the game master looks at the table and says, look, I'm not ruining the game. I am changing the rules because you, the players, have finally leveled up.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Right. You have completely mastered the basic version. If we keep playing with those old mechanics, you are never going to reach the next stage of complexity. You've essentially outgrown the tutorial.
Right. So it becomes a progression rather than a disruption. It's a necessary upgrade because you have a more advanced player base now.
Exactly.
And that visceral reaction, right, that hostility to the new rule book, that is the absolute perfect entry point into the core tension we are analyzing today.
Yeah, because the fundamental question Parwez is addressing in this lecture is how human beings react when divine directives actually shift to accommodate human evolution.
And the focal point of that shift revolves around one very specific word in the text.
Right. I was looking at Surah 16, Ayat 101, and the verse describes what happens when a new directive replaces an old one. And the text uses the term tabdil.
Tabdil, yes.
And the traditional commentary, it usually makes it sound like a correction of a past mistake.
Yeah.
But Parwez reads it completely differently, doesn't he?
He does. The interpretation of that single word, tabdil, essentially shapes two entirely different worldviews.
How so?
Well, in the traditional, often critical framework, when a previous divine law is changed or replaced by a new one, it's viewed through the lens of human error.
Like somebody messed up.
Right. Critics look at the text and argue, well, if the original law was handed down by a perfect, all-knowing creator, why on earth would it need to be amended?
Yeah, a flawless architect doesn't draft blueprints that need fixing later.
Exactly the argument. Therefore, they conclude that tabdil implies a flaw in the original design, or worse, that the person bringing the new law is just making it up.
So they're looking at it like a software patch fixing a bug that shouldn't have been there in the first place.
That is the exact trap Parwez identifies. He argues that this is a fundamental misreading of both the linguistics of the word and the architecture of the divine system.
Okay.
So for him, tabdil is not the correction of an error. It is a deliberate, meticulously planned phase shift.
A phase shift. I like that.
Right. The divine amr, the directive or command, is designed to adapt to the specific evolutionary stage of human history. The law didn't change because the lawgiver made a mistake.
Right.
The law changed because the subject of the law, humanity itself, had moved into an entirely new phase of cognitive and social existence.
Okay, so it makes me think about human biology and medicine.
Oh, the medical analogy from the text, yes.
Yeah. Let's say you go to a medical specialist because you are dealing with a severe infection. The doctor assesses your current physical state, runs the labs, and writes you a prescription. Let's just say it's a heavy course of antibiotics.
Standard protocol.
Right. It is the perfect, flawless intervention for exactly where your immune system is at that specific moment. You take the medication, you rest, and 10 days later, the infection is cleared, but your body is depleted.
Sure.
So you go back for a follow-up. The doctor does not hand you the exact same prescription for more antibiotics.
No, that would be terrible for you.
Exactly. They change the directive. Now, they prescribe probiotics, maybe physical therapy, and a specific diet to rebuild your strength.
And no rational patient would look at that doctor and accuse them of being a fraud for changing the prescription.
Right. You wouldn't say, wait, last week you said antibiotics were the absolute truth for my health, and now you're saying I shouldn't take them. Your first prescription must have been a lie.
That would be absurd.
Yeah.
You would understand that the underlying principle, which is restoring your baseline health, is absolute and unchanging.
Yes.
But the method, the specific bylaw governing what you put in your body, well, that has to adapt because your condition has physically changed.
The first prescription works so well that you essentially graduated out of needing it.
Precisely. And when we map that medical analogy onto the sociology of human history, Parwez's thesis becomes incredibly clear. Humanity is the patient, and the divine directives are the prescriptions. As humanity's collective intellect matured, as we transition from isolated nomadic tribes scratching out survival in the desert into complex agrarian societies.
And eventually into interconnected global civilization.
Right. The prescription had to shift.
Yeah.
Because the social metabolism of a Bronze Age tribe is fundamentally different from the social metabolism of a multi-continental empire.
I mean, I understand the logic of the progression. But I can totally imagine someone listening to this and wondering, well, if the source of the law is omniscient, right? Yeah. And it already knows that humanity will eventually need the complex globalized rulebook, why not just drop the final code in 2000 BCE?
That's a very common question.
Right. Why go through the tutorial phases at all? If the ultimate goal is a highly advanced equitable society, why not just hand the ancient Mesopotamians the equivalent of the year 2026 legal framework?
Well, it comes down to the cognitive and institutional capacity of the recipient. A directive is utterly useless if it cannot be comprehended, let alone implemented, by the people receiving it.
That makes sense.
Think about it like this. If you walk into a first-grade classroom and hand a 6-year-old a university-level textbook on multivariable calculus, are you turning them into a mathematician?
No, you're probably just making them cry.
Exactly. You are just overwhelming them with abstract symbols they have absolutely no framework to process.
So the knowledge might be objectively true, but it's completely inaccessible to them at that stage.
Right. And forcing a modern, intricate legal system, one that requires global communication networks, abstract economic understanding, advanced jurisprudence.
All the stuff we have today.
Right. Forcing that onto a society that hasn't even invented the wheel wouldn't just be ineffective. It would cause total systemic collapse.
Because they wouldn't have the institutional scaffolding to support it.
Exactly. The human intellect required a gradual, nurturing process. And this brings us to the most crucial distinction in Parwez's entire framework.
Okay, what's that?
To resolve the tension of these shifting laws, the source material introduces a rigid boundary between two concepts. On one side, permanent principles. On the other, changeable bylaws.
Okay, let's break that down.
In his terminology, the core religion, Deen, is comprised exclusively of permanent, unchangeable principles.
Like eternal truths.
Yes, eternal, universal truths that govern human flourishing. But the methodology, the program of action, or the specific situational rules, often referred to as Minhaj or Sharia.
Those are the bylaws.
Exactly. Those consist of the bylaws. And those bylaws absolutely must change based on time, geography, and the evolutionary stage of human advancement.
So principles are forever. Bylaws are temporary.
You got it.
The lecture actually grounds this with a really fascinating historical case study regarding the story of Noah and the Ark.
Oh, yes. That's a brilliant example.
Yeah, because I had always read that story purely as a moral fable,
Yeah.
About obedience and impending doom. But Parwez reads it as a marker of human intellectual evolution, specifically regarding engineering.
He treats it as a profound data point in the history of human capacity.
Really? How so?
Well, according to his analysis, during the era of Noah, humanity's collective intellect and understanding of the physical sciences were in their absolute infancy.
Okay.
So, When a massive geological cataclysm was imminent, the people simply did not have the accumulated knowledge to conceptualize, design, or construct a vessel capable of surviving that scale of flooding.
They didn't understand buoyancy or structural integrity.
Or naval architecture. None of it.
So the divine intervention had to be incredibly micromanaged.
Exactly.
God couldn't just say, a flood is coming, figure out a way to survive. The human intellect wasn't there yet. God had to essentially act as the chief architect.
Providing the exact blueprints, the specific materials, and the step-by-step instructions via direct revelation.
So the building of the wooden ark was a divine bylaw tailored for an infant intellect.
Yes. But the brilliance of the system is what happens thousands of years later.
Right.
Fast forward through the centuries. Humanity begins to accumulate knowledge. We discover metallurgy, thermodynamics, fluid dynamics, complex engineering.
We developed schools and an educational infrastructure to pass this knowledge across generations.
Precisely. So when later human societies needed to cross oceans or navigate treacherous waters, they didn't sit on the shoreline waiting for a new prophet to receive a divine revelation about how to build a boat.
Right. They didn't need God to whisper the schematics for an iron-hulled steamship or nuclear submarine into their ears. The phase of needing divine engineering blueprints was over.
Because they possessed the permanent principle, which is the mandate for survival, progress, and the utilization of natural resources to conquer the environment.
I see.
They applied their newly matured, evolved intellect to that permanent principle in order to draft their own new bylaws, their own engineering manuals for the steamship.
So the fundamental principle of navigating the waters remained eternal. But the bylaw of how to build a vessel shifted entirely from the realm of divine revelation to the realm of human scientific endeavor.
Exactly. It's a shift from direct instruction to delegating authority to human reason.
Man, that is such a cool way to look at it. And the lecture uses another analogy that I found really striking, moving from engineering over to biology.
A dietary needs analogy.
Yes. Think about the permanent principle of human life, which is nourishment. In order to survive, a biological organism must take in calories and nutrients.
Right. That principle is eternal.
Right. It applied to a hunter-gatherer 10,000 years ago, and it applies to you listening to this audio right now. But the bylaw, meaning the specific rules governing exactly what you put in your mouth, changes drastically over the course of just one human life.
The metabolic needs dictate the bylaw.
Exactly. When a human is in the infant stage, the absolute biological bylaw is the consumption of milk. A baby's digestive system doesn't have the enzymes or the physical hardware to process anything else.
Yeah.
If a well-meaning parent tries to feed a newborn a dense, heavy meal, say a roasted steak and potatoes, they won't nourish the child. They will kill it.
The system simply cannot process it.
But then, as the child grows into a healthy, active young adult, the metabolic reality changes. So the bylaw has to update.
Of course.
Now, a diet of exclusively breast milk or formula is insufficient. It would lead to malnutrition. They require heavy proteins, complex carbohydrates, fiber to sustain a higher output of energy.
Right. And then let's consider if that adult later contracts a severe gastrointestinal illness and is hospitalized.
Right.
The bylaw shifts again. The steak would suddenly be dangerous. They might be placed on a highly restricted diet of clear broths and intravenous electrolytes.
So the underlying goal, keeping the body alive, never wavered for a second.
No, never.
But imagine the catastrophic consequences of freezing the bylaws. Imagine the absurdity of an adult realizing they are sick, and instead of adjusting their diet to their current reality, they say, well, when I was an infant, milk kept me perfectly healthy. Milk is the original pure nourishment, so I'm going to regress to a diet of baby formula to cure this stomach ulcer.
It's an intellectual regression.
It really is. And that is the massive realization for me when reading the source material. Forcing a complex society in the modern era to govern itself using the specific situational bylaws of a previous, less developed era, it is exactly like forcing a healthy adult to eat sick-word food.
Or forcing a teenager to live on infant formula.
Right. You aren't preserving their purity, you're actively stunting their growth and suffocating their potential by locking them into a prescription meant for an entirely different phase of existence.
And yet, when we look at the historical record, this logical progression is rarely met with enthusiasm.
No, not at all.
When a new messenger arrived to a society with an updated diet, a new set of bylaws designed for a society that had outgrown its ancient constraints, the reaction was almost never relief.
It was almost universally met with violent, entrenched hostility.
Exactly, which requires a deep psychological dive.
Yeah, because if the upgrade is this beneficial, if moving from the wooden raft to the steamship is objectively better for human flourishing, why fight the phase shift? The source material points out a very specific pattern that happens the moment Tabdil occurs. The opponents immediately launch an accusation. They label the messenger with the term muftar.
Muftar, which translates to a forger or a liar.
Right. Why is that the go-to accusation?
Well, the psychology behind the accusation of forgery is fascinating. We have to analyze the internal cognitive architecture of the people making that claim.
Okay, let's do it.
Why do they assume it's a lie? It's because their internal logic is trapped within a static paradigm. They're operating on a fundamentally flawed premise regarding the nature of the divine.
What's the premise?
Their logical syllogism goes like this. We know for a fact that the previous law, the old rule book, came from God. This new messenger is bringing a law that directly contradicts or changes the old rulebook.
Right.
God is perfect and does not contradict himself. Therefore, this new law cannot possibly be from God. The messenger must be a fraud.
So they see contradiction where Parwez sees evolution. They are looking at the baby formula and the steak, placing them side by side and declaring, these are two wildly different substances. They can't both have been prescribed by the same expert nutritionist.
That is precisely the cognitive dissonance. And this is why Parwez heavily emphasizes the Quranic phrase, aktharum layalamun.
Which translates to, most of them do not know.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And he isn't saying the majority of people are inherently unintelligent.
Right.
He is arguing that the masses lack the systemic, macro-level knowledge to perceive the grand design. They are locked into a micro-perspective.
They only see the surface-level friction of the changing rule.
Exactly. They don't see the underlying unity of purpose. They fail to understand that shifting the temporary bylaws is the exact mechanism that allows the permanent principle to survive in a new environment.
So when they can't understand the system, they attack the person delivering the update. The lecture actually dives deep into the historical context of this, particularly examining the history of the Israelites. When prophets like Jesus or Muhammad arrived with an evolved framework, the established religious authorities of the time immediately accused them of violating the sacred laws of Moses.
Because the religious authorities had become entirely fixated on the mechanics of the how, while completely losing sight of the why.
Yeah.
The spirit of the law had evaporated, leaving only a calcified shell of rituals. And Parwez uses a brilliant narrative from the text to illustrate this psychological trap, the story of the cow.
Oh, man. This was easily one of the most illuminating parts of the archive for me.
It's incredible.
If you are familiar with the major Abrahamic texts, you might have encountered the story where the Israelites, shortly after escaping slavery, are ordered by divine command to slaughter a cow.
Right.
On a surface reading, it just sounds like an ancient, somewhat arbitrary agrarian sacrifice. But the sociological breakdown of this event completely reframes it.
We really have to place this event in its precise anthropological context. The Israelites had just spent generations enslaved in ancient Egypt. In the Egyptian pantheon, the bovine form was deeply sacred.
Yeah, you had deities like Apis, the sacred bull of Memphis.
Or Hathor, often depicted as a cow goddess associated with maternal care and the sky. The cow was not just livestock. It was a symbol of divine power, cultural dominance, and the very empire that had subjugated them.
So even though they had physically crossed the sea and left Egypt behind, the cultural programming of Egypt hadn't left their minds.
Exactly. They had internalized the iconography of their oppressors. The physical chains were gone, but the psychological chains remained perfectly intact.
Wow.
They still held a deep subconscious reverence for this symbol. Therefore, the divine command to slaughter a cow was never about the physical act of animal sacrifice.
Right. God didn't need a barbecue.
No, it was a rigorous, highly targeted psychological exercise. They were being ordered to take the ultimate symbol of their former masters, the idol that still lived rent-free in their minds, and publicly, physically destroy it.
It was a test of psychological liberation, demanding they sever their toxic emotional ties to the culture of their enslavement.
Yes. But the traditionalist mindset, the mindset that is terrified of internal change, completely misses the why.
Right.
They don't want to engage with the agonizing process of killing their internal idols. The psychological weight of that liberation is just too heavy.
So how do they avoid it without outright rebelling.
They use bureaucracy, they weaponize the how to delay the action.
It is a masterclass in bureaucratic filibustering.
Truly.
When the command is given, they don't immediately comply. Instead, they start asking a series of increasingly microscopic, obsessive questions.
Right. Okay, we hear the command to slaughter a cow, but what age should it be? Should it be a calf or an older cow?
The answer is given. Somewhere in between. So they pivot and ask, okay, but what exact shade of color should it be?
The answer comes. A bright, pleasing yellow.
Still not satisfied, they ask, has this cow ever been used to plow a field or water the soil?
They just keep narrowing the parameters. And they aren't doing this because they are deeply pious individuals desperately trying to execute the command perfectly.
No, not at all.
They are doing it because they are hoping that if they ask enough questions, the criteria will eventually become so impossibly specific that such a cow will not exist on the earth.
And if they can't find the cow, they don't have to slaughter it.
Exactly. And if they don't have to slaughter it, they don't have to face the trauma of changing their mindset.
It's the ultimate defense mechanism against evolution. It's the equivalent of a modern bureaucracy saying, we agree in principle that the system needs to change, but we are going to form a committee to debate the precise punctuation of subsection C, paragraph 4, for the next 20 years.
Yeah, they bury the phase shift in red tape because engaging with the spirit of the law requires actual painful growth.
And this brings us to a critical realization. This desperate clinging to old bylaws, this bureaucratic obsession with the past, is rarely just an accident of human stubbornness.
No, it's systemic.
It is almost always driven by powerful structural forces within a society that actively benefit from stagnation. We really need to dig into the sociology of that, because it seems like no matter what era of history you analyze, there is always a coordinated group hitting the brakes on human intellect.
Absolutely.
Who actually benefits from keeping the societal rulebook frozen in time.
Parwez delves into what he terms social physics, specifically analyzing the inertia of tradition.
Okay, social physics.
Think of Newton's first law of motion. A body at rest will stay at rest, and a body in motion will stay in motion unless acted upon by an external force.
Sure.
Societies operate on the exact same principle. Traditionalists want the cultural, legal, and economic inertia of their ancestors to continue uninterrupted forever.
Right.
And the primary beneficiaries of this inertia are the vested interests, which historically manifest as an alliance between absolute political power and religious authority.
The classic alliance of the crown and the altar.
Yes. And the text symbolizes this dynamic using the figures of Pharaoh and Haman.
Pharaoh represents the political and economic monopoly, the state that controls the wealth, the military, and the physical bodies of the citizens.
And Haman represents the religious clergy, the institution that controls the mythology, the beliefs, and the minds of the citizens.
Okay.
The dynamic is incredibly symbiotic. A ruler like Pharaoh wants to exploit the labor of the masses, hoard the nation's resources, and maintain absolute, unquestioned authority.
Naturally.
But ruling purely through physical coercion and state violence is exhausting, expensive, and ultimately fragile. If you push people hard enough, they will eventually realize they outnumber you and rebel.
You can't put a guard in every single home.
No, you can't. You need the people to internalize the prison. You need them to willingly accept their own subjugation.
And that is exactly where the clergy steps in to provide the necessary psychological infrastructure.
Precisely. The mechanism of control relies on myth-making. The clergy approaches the exploited peasantry and says, this massive inequality isn't just the king's arbitrary law. This is God's eternal, unchanging will.
So when a peasant looks at the unimaginable opulence of the royal palace, and then looks at their own starving children, the natural biological instinct is anger.
Yes.
It is the instinct to tear down the unjust system. But the religious authority intercepts that anger and neutralizes it.
They say, do not rebel, do not question the social order. God is the one who distributes wealth, and he, in his infinite wisdom, has chosen to make the king rich and you poor.
Your poverty is a divine decree.
Your suffering is actually a spiritual test. If you endure this injustice quietly and obediently, you will be rewarded with infinite wealth in the afterlife.
Man, it is the weaponization of destiny. By convincing the masses that the social order is a frozen divine mandate, the clergy suppresses any intellectual or political awakening.
Right, because if the rules of the game cannot be changed because God wrote them, then the economy cannot be reformed and the political hierarchy cannot be challenged.
The king maintains his wealth, the clergy maintains their elite status as the exclusive interpreters of the divine will, and the peasants remain pacified.
And this is the exact societal inertia that Parwez argues the Quran is trying to shatter.
The concept of tabdil.
Exactly. The divine system upgrade acts as the external force in social physics. The new revelation hits this stagnant, pacified society like a wrecking ball.
It forces the human intellect to wake up, to critically examine their reality, and to realize that these oppressive structures are not divine mandates. They're man-made cages.
Parwez notes that the ultimate trajectory of this evolution is moving humanity away from the subjugation of individuals. The goal is to reach a state where society is focused on the administration of things.
Managing resources, infrastructure, economics.
Right, rather than the ruling of people.
Yep.
No human being, regardless of their bloodline or clerical title, has the divine right to override another human being's autonomy.
That is a massive paradigm shift. It completely inverts the function of religion. Instead of being a tool for pacification, it becomes an engine for intellectual and social liberation.
It does.
But the vested interests, the pharaohs and the Hamans of the world, they aren't just going to quietly pack up and relinquish their power when a new revelation threatens their monopoly.
No, they definitely are not.
So if they cannot physically stop the new framework from taking root, what is their backup plan?
If you cannot destroy the revolution from the outside, you infiltrate and neutralize it from the inside. And this brings us to one of the most intellectually jarring and controversial topics in the entire lecture, the traditional doctrine of nask, or abrogation.
Okay, I have to admit, when I was reading the historical background on this concept, I had to stop and reread it several times to make sure I was understanding it correctly.
It's a lot to take in.
Parwez is pointing out that within traditional jurisprudence, there are scholars who believe that certain verses that are currently printed in a text they consider to be the absolute infallible word of God, are actually legally dead.
Yes.
Like, the text is right there on the page, but the rule it contains has been canceled.
That is the precise definition of the doctrine of nask. It is the established belief in traditional Islamic scholarship that certain verses existing within the Quran have had their legal rulings nullified or abrogated by other verses that were revealed chronologically later.
The cognitive dissonance required to maintain that belief is just staggering to me. How does a scholarly tradition look at a text they revere as perfectly preserved and conclude, yes, chapter 2, verse whatever, that one is void? Just ignore the legal implications of that sentence. How did they arrive at that conclusion historically?
To understand the genesis of this doctrine, we really have to trace the historical drift that occurred in the centuries following the original revelation.
Okay.
Remember our earlier discussion about the crucial difference between permanent principles and temporary bylaws?
Right.
And how specific directives were given as medical prescriptions for very specific temporary situations during the community's infancy.
Yeah, the idea that a rule might apply during a time of intense persecution, but wouldn't apply once the community was established and secure.
Precisely. As the early generations passed away, the systemic framework that Parwez is outlining began to erode. Later generations of scholars, operating hundreds of years removed from the original context, looked at the compiled text and found verses that appeared to give different directives for somewhat similar situations.
Okay, I see where this is going.
Because they had lost the macro-level understanding of tabdil, because they couldn't distinguish between a permanent, overarching principle and a temporary bylaw designed for a specific phase, they saw contradiction.
Oh, wow. They fell into the exact same psychological trap as the ancient critics who accused the messengers of forgery.
Exactly.
They saw two different prescriptions, placed them side by side, and said, these conflict. They cannot both be active law simultaneously.
You've got it. But there was a key difference. The ancient critics didn't believe in the text, so they just called it a forgery. These later scholars did believe in the text. They couldn't call it a fabrication.
Right, they had to respect it.
So they had to invent a different intellectual mechanism to resolve the perceived contradictions in their own minds. Thus, they formulated the doctrine of nask. They rationalized it by claiming God revealed this first verse for a certain time. Later, God updated the rule and revealed a second verse, which legally cancels the first one, even though he left both of them physically written in the book.
But the theological implications of that are wild. It implies that the text is just, I don't know, a messy scrapbook of trial and error.
Yeah.
It suggests a lack of foresight, as if the lawgiver was just making it up as they went along and forgot to delete the rough drafts.
Which is exactly why Parwez mounts such a fierce critique against the entire concept. He argues unequivocally that Naskh is a human invention.
Interesting.
It was a theoretical patch created by later jurists to explain away their own lack of systemic understanding. And you can trace the intellectual fragility of this concept by looking at how it evolved over time.
How so?
Well, in the early centuries of scholarship, some jurists claimed there were upwards of 500 abrogated verses in the Quran.
500 verses. That is a massive percentage of the text just legally wiped out. You are effectively gutting the Constitution.
It was a highly chaotic approach to jurisprudence. But as time went on and the intellectual rigor of later scholars increased, they began to realize how legally and theologically problematic it was to claim that hundreds of verses were dead letters.
Right.
So you see a historical whittling down. A prominent later scholar, Shah Waliullah of Delhi in the 18th century, reviewed the massive list of claims and, through his own analysis, reduced the number of genuinely abrogated verses from 500 down to just 5.
From 500 down to 5.
Yes.
I mean, that is the ultimate proof of Parwez's argument, isn't it?
Yeah.
If scholars mistakenly believe that 495 verses were legally canceled for centuries, it proves that the concept of cancellation wasn't an objective divine reality encoded in the text.
Exactly.
It was just generations of humans arguing over their own subjective interpretations, trying to force the text to make sense without the key of Tabdil. Parwez is exposing the fact that the entire enterprise was a human projection.
He absolutely is. And he highlights the sheer absurdity of the situation with a very sharp, almost dark sense of irony.
Yeah.
Parwez asks the traditionalists a very simple question. If a verse is legally dead, if it has absolutely no power to guide human action, shape society, or govern the economy anymore, why is it still in the book? Why do you insist on reverently reciting a canceled law?
The rationale that traditionalists give for this is fascinating and honestly deeply troubling if you care about the practical application of law. They claim it remains for the reward of reciting it.
The irony of reward. The traditional defense shifted the value of the text from its meaning to its mere phonetic pronunciation.
Right.
In this mindset, simply vocalizing the Arabic syllables generates invisible spiritual reward points. For example, reciting the letters Alif Lam Mim might accrue 30 units of divine merit, regardless of whether the person reciting it understands the structural meaning of the verse they are reading.
It fundamentally changes the nature of the book. Instead of treating it as a dynamic blueprint for building an equitable civilization, instead of utilizing it as an active constitution to govern human affairs, they have essentially reduced it to a spellbook.
A spellbook, exactly.
You just chant the dead laws over and over to level up your spiritual high score, while completely ignoring the mandate to execute the actual principles in the real world.
It is the ultimate neutralization of a revolutionary text. It allows the vested interests, the modern equivalents of Hemin, to keep the populace highly religious by having them constantly memorize and recite the book, while simultaneously stripping the book of its ability to threaten the status quo.
You neutralize the threat of the upgrade by convincing everyone to just chant the old code without ever trying to run the program.
That's a perfect way to summarize it.
But to really grasp how dangerous this traditional mindset is, how it's not just about abstract theology, but about severe real-world consequences, we have to look at how the clergy actually overrides permanent law.
Yes, the stakes get very high here.
This isn't just about reading dead verses. This is about life and death jurisprudence. And that brings us to the ultimate case study in the lecture: the punishment for adultery, the practice of stoning, and the narrative of the lost verses.
This is perhaps the most forceful, high-stakes argument Parwez makes in the entire lecture. It deals with the legal punishment known as Raj, or stoning to death.
Okay.
Parwez points out a glaring, irreconcilable discrepancy between the explicit written text of the Quran and the traditional established Islamic jurisprudence that was codified centuries later.
Let's lay out the facts as Parwez presents them. What does the written text actually mandate?
The Quran explicitly mandates a punishment of 100 lashes for the crime of adultery. And critically, Parwez notes, the text is absolute in its uniformity. It makes absolutely no distinction between married or unmarried individuals.
Okay.
The law is clear, universal, and when viewed in the context of ancient penal codes, comparatively limited in its severity.
But that explicit text is not what traditional Islamic law dictates. Traditional jurisprudence created a massive division. They mandate stoning to death, rajam, specifically for married individuals who commit adultery.
Correct.
So the obvious question arises: if the text is universally clear, and the text says 100 lashes across the board, where did the legal justification for executing people via stoning come from?
That is the critical tension. And the traditional answer, which Parwez dissects with sheer incredulity, relies on an extraordinary narrative found in the Hadith literature, the oral traditions compiled centuries after the fact.
Okay.
Specifically, it relies on a highly controversial tradition attributed to Aisha, the Prophet's wife.
This is the narrative about the goat.
Yes.
When I first encountered this in the research, I thought it had to be a metaphor.
No, it is treated by traditionalists as literal history. The
Okay.
narrative claims that there was originally a verse revealed in the Quran that explicitly and unambiguously mandated stoning to death for adultery. According to the tradition, this specific verse was written down on a leaf or a piece of parchment and kept safely under Aisha's bed. However, during the intense grief and chaotic period surrounding the passing of the Prophet, the story asserts that a hungry domestic goat wandered into the room and ate the leaf.
A goat ate the verse.
Uh.
A farm animal physically consumed a piece of the eternal law.
According to this specific historical claim, yes. Therefore, the physical words are gone. They are no longer present in the compiled Quran.
Right.
But, and this is the breathtaking leap of logic in traditional jurisprudence, they argue that even though the text was physically destroyed by livestock, the law contained within that digested leaf remains legally binding upon humanity forever.
Imagine the vast implications of what is being argued there.
Yeah.
You have a written constitution that you believe is perfectly preserved, guarded by the highest divine authority. It clearly and explicitly writes down the punishment as 100 lashes.
Yeah.
But the traditionalists are arguing that you should bypass that clear written law and instead execute human beings by stoning them to death, based on a centuries-old oral story that a goat accidentally ate a different rule.
You can almost hear Parwez's intellectual exasperation bleeding through the archival text. He mounts a devastating attack on the entire premise of this narrative. For Parwez, this isn't just factually absurd, it is legally and theologically catastrophic.
It completely voids the core premise of the entire religion. The Quran contains multiple, explicit promises regarding its own divine preservation. It claims to be an incorruptible text.
Right.
If a random goat can wander into a tent, eat a verse, and permanently alter the eternal legal code of humanity, then the promise of divine preservation is entirely empty. The integrity of the whole system just collapses.
Exactly. But Parwez goes beyond just pointing out the theological contradiction. He acts as a legal historian, asking why this narrative was accepted and propagated in the first place.
What's his conclusion?
He argues that the goat narrative is a fabricated loophole. It was a backdoor mechanism engineered by later generations to bypass the clear, lenient, and permanent law of the Quran, specifically so they could revert to the harsh, older tribal laws that they were culturally comfortable with.
It's the inertia of tradition rearing its head again.
Exactly.
The pre-Islamic ancient tribal societies were deeply accustomed to brutal, absolute punishments like stoning. It was part of their cultural DNA. When the new phase shift came, when the Quran introduced the upgrade and said, no, the penalty is 100 lashes, the brutal executions end here, the society simply couldn't accept the upgrade.
They wanted their old, familiar, brutal rules back.
So they utilized this narrative of a lost verse to essentially override the written text with their own cultural baggage.
It is a profound sociological insight. It shows how a society can smuggle pre-Islamic foreign traditions back into a system under the guise of lost divine authority. If they can't change the text, they claim the text they want was lost, but its authority remains. And Parwez points out that this dilution of the text's absolute authority doesn't just happen through extreme dramatic claims like goats eating verses.
How else does it happen?
It also happens in much more insidious, subtle ways, specifically through the mechanics of how the text is read aloud. This brings us to the issue of the Qur'at, or the varying recitations of the Quran, and how linguistic variations create an illusion of conflict.
So we're moving from the controversy of missing verses to a controversy over the verses that are actually still printed on the page, but people are fighting over how to pronounce them.
Correct. Within the traditional Islamic world, there are several recognized and accepted ways of reciting the Quran, known as the Qur'at. Parwez makes a very vital, clarifying distinction here to prevent confusion. He says we must separate harmless regional phonetic accents from dangerous sectarian claims of textual alteration.
It's the linguistic difference between someone from Texas saying y'all and someone from New York saying you guys.
Yeah, that's a good analogy.
The underlying meaning, the intention to address a plural group, is exactly the same. It's just a geographical variation in the musical tone of the language.
Exactly. Parwez has absolutely no issue with the fact that an Egyptian reciter might use a different musical cadence or a slight phonetic variation compared to a reciter from the Hejaz region in Saudi Arabia. That is just natural human linguistics. It's harmless.
Right.
The problem, the real danger, arises when these slight variations in vocalization are weaponized. The danger is when sects claim that these aren't just accents, but actual differences in the word or grammatical meanings of the text, allegedly passed down from different companions of the prophet.
And this is where linguistic trivia turns into sectarian warfare. The lecture actually provides a perfect example of this regarding the ritual of wudu, which is the specific ablution or washing process required before a believer engages in prayer.
This is one of the classic historical dividing lines between major sects.
Really? Just overwashing.
Yes. The Quranic verse that instructs believers on how to physically clean themselves before prayer contains a specific Arabic word referring to the feet. Because Arabic uses diacritical marks, vowel markers, to determine grammar, a slight variation in how a single vowel is read or recited at the end of that word dramatically alters the verb's action.
Okay.
Because of this single vowel variation in different traditions, two entirely different physical practices emerged.
One sect reads the vowel one way, making the grammar connect to the verb for washing. Therefore, they conclude the absolute divine command is that they must physically wash their feet with pouring water.
And another sect reads the vowel with a different diacritical mark, connecting the grammar to the verb for wiping. They conclude the divine command is merely to wipe their feet with wet hands.
And we aren't just talking about a polite disagreement in a seminary. Human beings have been arguing, segregating their mosques, and sometimes engaging in violent sectarian conflict over this single vowel for centuries.
Indeed, they have. But Parwez's core argument cuts straight through the noise of this historical debate. He argues vehemently that the Quran was perfectly preserved in one unified singular text.
Okay.
The idea that famous companions of the Prophet, like Ibn Masud or Ibn Abbas, possessed their own differing personal scrolls known as mushafs, with different words, added synonyms, or differing grammatical structures, is, according to Parwez, yet another historical fabrication.
But why fabricate that? What is the sociological motive for inventing the idea that the Prophet's closest friends had different versions of the book?
The motive is sectarian justification.
Nah.
If you are trying to legitimize your specific sect's unique practice, like the wiping of the feet instead of washing, and the primary universally accepted text doesn't explicitly support your grammar, it is incredibly convenient to claim, well, the great companion Ibn Abbas had a personal, authentic copy of the Quran that read the vowel my way.
It creates an illusion of ancient apostolic authority for a much later political or theological division.
Exactly. Parwez argues that these stories of differing companion scrolls were invented retrospectively to justify the existence of sects. And crucially, the effect of these stories is the dilution of the book's absolute authority.
It shatters the anchor. If you are playing that board game and every single player at the table pulls out a slightly different version of the rule book, the game master loses all authority. There is no objective standard to appeal to. Everyone just argues endlessly over which rulebook is the true one, and the game grinds to a halt. The progress of the society stops.
That is the ultimate consequence. So Parwez is acting as an intellectual groundskeeper here. He is clearing away centuries of accumulated historical debris.
Okay.
If we follow his logic and we strip away the human invention of abrogated verses, if we discard the absurd narratives of lost verses eaten by livestock, and if we reject the sectarian weaponization of differing recitations, what are we left with?
If we clear the board completely, what is the actual engine that the Quran provides for humanity to govern itself and adapt to the future?
This brings us to Parwez's ultimate synthesis, the final major concept, Shura, or mutual consultation.
Okay, so how does this practical engine actually work for a society trying to navigate the modern world?
It works by recognizing that we have been given a system designed for perpetual motion, not a museum exhibit. We've established the foundation. The Quran provides the permanent principles.
Right.
It gives us the eternal truths like the absolute necessity of justice, equity, the protection of human dignity, and the guarantee of basic economic provisions for all citizens. Those principles are the unchangeable deen.
Right.
But for the mechanics of everyday life, the specific bylaws, the day-to-day administration of the legal system, the exact shape of the tax code, the structure of the parliamentary government, The text deliberately does not give frozen, highly specific rules.
Yeah.
Instead, it provides humanity with the ultimate dynamic tool, Shura.
Democratic mutual consultation, gathering the intellect of the community to solve the problems of the present moment.
Exactly. Parwez's insight here is deeply profound regarding the timeline of human history. He points out that the Quran explicitly states that the line of prophethood ended with Muhammad.
Which people usually view as a loss.
Right. For centuries, people have viewed that as a sort of tragedy, a cutting off of divine communication. Parwez views it as the exact opposite. He argues that the end of prophethood was a triumphant declaration of humanity's intellectual maturity.
Yeah.
The divine system is effectively saying, you are no longer infants. You no longer need a prophet to hold your hand and spoon-feed you specific bylaws for every minor dispute. Your collective intellect has evolved. You have grown up.
We don't need a new prophet to come down from a mountain to tell us how to regulate the ethics of artificial intelligence. We don't need a new revelation to explain how to build a modern, decentralized healthcare system or how to structure international trade agreements in a globalized economy.
We don't need divine blueprints for those things because we have the capacity to design them ourselves.
All right.
The expectation embedded in the system is that we take the permanent values, for example, the explicit Quranic principle that wealth must not be allowed to circulate only among the rich, and we use Shura, our collective democratic intellect, to draft temporary bylaws that enforce that principle in the reality of the year 2026.
Maybe that means progressive taxation or universal basic income or specific corporate regulations.
Yes. And then, when the year 2050 rolls around and the economic landscape has changed, and those bylaws are now outdated and causing friction, we use Shura to scrap them and draft new ones.
We are empowered to execute our own tabdil.
Yeah.
We become the active intellectual agents of the phase shift, constantly upgrading the bylaws to ensure the permanent principles survive.
It's an incredibly empowering vision of human agency.
It really is.
But it also leads to what Parwez clearly sees as the great tragedy of the modern era. You can really feel the weight of his lament as the lecture concludes. He looks at the state of the traditional Muslim world and essentially says, you have taken this engine of progress and run it completely in reverse.
It is a devastating systemic critique. He argues that instead of embracing this dynamic evolutionary engine, traditionalists have done the exact opposite of what the system designed.
Yeah.
They have functionally abandoned the Quran, meaning they have abandoned the focus on implementing the permanent, dynamic principles of equity and justice. And in its place, they cling obsessively to the frozen, highly specific bylaws formulated by human jurists in the 8th and 9th centuries.
Right. They treat those ancient, human-made legal codes as if they are divine, unchangeable, and binding forever.
They took the specific sick-word diet that was prescribed for a society 1,000 years ago, and they are aggressively forcing healthy, modern people to eat it today.
It's toxic.
And the psychological consequence of this is catastrophic, especially when you look at the next generation. Parwez uses a beautifully simple, highly relatable analogy about a pair of shoes to drive this point home.
The shoe analogy perfectly encapsulates the tragedy of traditionalism.
It does.
Imagine you were given a beautiful, perfectly crafted pair of shoes when you are 10 years old. At that moment in your life, they fit your feet perfectly. They protect you from the elements. They allow you to run and play. They are the exact right bylaw for your current physical phase.
Sure.
Now imagine you are 20 years old. You have grown physically and intellectually. But a religious authority demands that you must continue to wear those exact same 10-year-old shoes.
It would be agonizing. Your feet have grown. The shoes are now constraints. You literally cannot walk, let alone run or progress, because the structure that once protected you is now crushing you.
Exactly. When you force a modern young person whose intellect, scientific understanding, and societal reality have expanded massively due to centuries of human progress to wear the intellectual and legal shoes of a society from the Middle Ages, only two outcomes are possible.
Either the young person will conform out of fear, force their expanding intellect into the tiny shoes, and permanently cripple their own potential.
Or, driven by a sheer biological instinct for survival, they will tear the shoes off, throw them away entirely, and choose to walk barefoot.
Wow.
Parwez is arguing that because traditionalists have falsely presented these frozen ancient bylaws as the religion, the youth are running away from religion entirely. They look at the ancient rules and correctly perceive that they are crippling their progress, but they mistakenly believe that the religion itself is the problem, when in reality the problem is just an outdated pair of shoes that the system explicitly demanded they outgrow and replace using the engine of Shura.
That is a profoundly tragic misunderstanding. The very tool meant to liberate them is being wielded as the tool that binds them. We have covered an incredible amount of intellectual ground today. Let's summarize the architecture of the journey we've been on through Lecture 1215.
Sounds good.
We started by completely redefining the word tabdil. We moved away from the idea that it's a correction of a divine mistake and understood it as a necessary evolutionary upgrade, a deliberate phase shift in the rules of the game to match human maturity.
From there, we explored the vital distinction between eternal, permanent principles, deen, and the temporary shifting bylaws, sharia.
Right.
We analyzed how the confusion between those two categories leads stagnant minds to accuse innovators and messengers of forgery. We also dove deep into the sociology of stagnation, looking at how vested interests, the alliance of oppressive political rulers and complicit religious clergy, utilize the inertia of tradition to pacify the masses and maintain their monopolies on power.
We looked at the specific historical mechanisms the clergy used to neutralize the dynamic power of the text. We examined the human invention of nasq, or abrogated verses, to explain away their own cognitive dissonance.
Yeah.
We dismantled the wild, legally disastrous claims of lost verses regarding the punishment of stoning, and we saw how simple linguistic accents were weaponized into sectarian divides through the Quran.
And finally, we arrived at Parwez's ultimate solution for human governance. The realization that the end of prophethood marks the graduation of humanity. We are now empowered and expected to use Shura, democratic mutual consultation, to continuously adapt, upgrade, and rewrite our societal bylaws, so long as we anchor those new laws to the permanent Quranic principles of justice and human dignity.
It is a massive paradigm shift. It completely changes how you view history, law, and human agency.
Okay.
But before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to chew on.
Okay.
We have spent the last hour looking backward. We've analyzed ancient peoples, the Israelites delaying their psychological liberation by asking endless questions about a cow, or the traditionalists desperately clinging to 8th century jurisprudence. And it's very easy to look at them with a sense of modern superiority.
Oh, very easy.
We look at their history and think, how could they be so blind? How could they be so stuck? How could they violently cling to obsolete rules when the upgrade was right in front of them?
But the true value of Parwez's framework is applying it to the present. Let's turn the mirror on ourselves.
Exactly.
Look around at our modern, highly secular institutions today. Look at our constitutional legal codes that take decades of agonizing political warfare to amend, even when they clearly no longer serve the populace.
Yep.
Look at our global economic systems that continue to generate massive, devastating inequality simply because we refuse to fundamentally alter the underlying formulas written centuries ago. Look at our entrenched political structures.
The question we have to ask ourselves is, are we doing the exact same thing today? Are we suffering from the exact same inertia of tradition in our own modern advanced systems?
It's a tough question.
Are we too terrified to use our collective intellect to upgrade the rules, even though the world around us, with the advent of artificial intelligence, global climate change, and instant global connectivity, has clearly leveled up? Have we just built new, modern idols of the free market, or idols of constitutional originalism that we are too psychologically terrified to slaughter?
We've seen how the law adapts to human progress. In Lecture 1315, covering Ayat 101-106, we will look at the source code of this revelation, why no human, especially a foreign speaker, could have fabricated a system so intellectually profound.